We thought last week about the genuine care that Paul had for the Corinthians, even though he had had to write to them about an offender in the assembly. Now, the fact that Paul does not go into much detail about the offender means that it's a little difficult to unravel the verses that we're going to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. But if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. Sufficient to such a man is this punishment which is inflicted of many. So that contrariwise ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Wherefore I beseech you that ye would confirm your love toward him. For to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you, whether ye be obedient in all things. To whom ye forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave anything, to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Christ, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. Paul decided not to go to Corinth in order to spare the Corinthians from immediate disciplinary action. That would have been painful for them. Instead, he wrote a letter urging them to deal with an offender in the assembly. That's the letter referred to in verses 2 and 4 of chapter 2. When Paul wrote, if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, in verse 5, it suggests that the offence he is referring to may have been something that had a personal bearing upon him as an apostle. Possibly the man in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 had, on receipt of 1 Corinthians, launched a bitter attack on Paul's apostolic authority. However, it seems that as a result of Paul's severe letter, the assembly had dealt with the wrongdoer. Paul indicates that that discipline was right and proper, but also that it was sufficient. Sufficient to such a man is this punishment in verse 6. It was sufficient because it appears that the offender had repented. He had had genuine sorrow, but it was important that he should not be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow in verse 7. Which brings us to an important point. It seems that in 1 Corinthians the assembly had been slow to deal with the sin of 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now it appears that they had been slow to bring a man back into fellowship following his repentance. And we can be like that too. We like people to stew a little bit in their wrongs. Paul urges, ye ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, verse 7. Having exercised discipline which the offender had submitted to and seen evidence of repentance, now was the time to forgive. Indeed, a failure to do so could give rise to a spirit of despondency, which would completely overwhelm the repentant man. He might be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow, verse 7. Forgiveness cannot be experienced if there is no repentance, but equally, if repentance is not accompanied by forgiveness, it could have a very damaging result. Forgiveness is an expression of genuine love for the penitent. I beseech you that you would confirm your love toward him, in verse 8. They should assure him that his repentance was accepted. Forgiveness is also an indication of obedience to the Lord. Yes, they had to be obedient to the Lord in dealing with the offender, but they also had to be obedient in restoring the repentant man to the fellowship of the assembly. Paul was anxious to know whether ye be obedient in all things, in verse 9. Failure in either of these things could mean that Satan should get an advantage of us, in verse 11. Just as sin gives a foothold for the devil, so does an unforgiving spirit. He will use any means to further his divisive purposes and deprive God's assembly of one of its members. So let us not be party to the devil's work in any way, particularly by having an unforgiving spirit.